So, Duane, man, it is really great to connect with you again on this podcast, Psyche. I know the listeners won't necessarily know this, but you and I have kind of sparked a friendship outside of the podcast world offline. And it's been really great to connect with you. We've talked about so many awesome things that I felt like it'd be great for just the world to hear some of our ramblings and bullshit. So I'm just kind of curious to see where it goes. But let me just say it's just good to see your face and it's good to connect.
It's definitely mutual. I feel the same way. It's really nice when you can build friendships that are not based upon horizontal identifications, but are based upon a certain type of shared interest in the work and in articulating the discontents of our time.
Yeah. No, that's really good. Now, when you say the friendships based on horizontal identifications, what do you mean by that? Like what rubs you the wrong way about that? I think that's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, I think this is some of the work that's been coming out of the New Lacanian school. Um, but you're seeing it in other places. I can't remember who it was, but somebody recently, quite a well-known psychoanalyst, came out with a book on. She didn't call it fraternities, but it was basically the same idea that what happens when the father falls, when patriarchy as an organizing principle of the social bond falls, is that there can be social bonds based upon horizontal identifications with the siblings, with the brothers, with the comrades, and these sorts of things. And that can produce a certain type of insularity that I'm increasingly suspicious of, a certain type of retreat from the world together. And I think that's actually how Lacan put it at one time. There's this way in which you are building a world as a bubble, and by living inside of the bubble, you think that's the world. But every
Mm,
time the bubble confronts the world, it potentially pops.
mm. Ooh, I love that, Duane. And I'm gonna admit I can fall into that myself if I'm not careful. I see quite a bit of that lately, like on Twitter, on social media, on the internet. Is that where you're confronting it as well? Do you have any specific examples you could talk about?
Um, well, I think there's a lot of different examples, but the most prevalent one, I mean, we're all kind of familiar with it, is the way in which social movements have evolved, particularly in the West, particularly in the American continent. They've evolved in a particular direction. Like let's say there were kind of three paradigms of social movements in the West. I think this is key. And we can see these social movements as perhaps exemplary of a particular type of politics in a particular era, each perhaps being the defining feature of its era. The first one would be what some sociologists have called old social movements, OSMs. The old social movement paradigm was this idea that social movements can be formed based upon a universal or quasi-universal belief in exploitation. We have been exploited. We become conscious of our exploitation. We're working in factories or whatever. We're part of some sort of proletariat, something like that. And if we could just become a class for ourselves, we could overthrow capitalism and the class-based mode of stratification and usher in perhaps something like communism. This
Hmm.
was a particular politics that we would consider to be revolutionary at a particular era. I'm not saying that paradigm has evaporated. It's certainly still here.
Sure.
You can see it in Western Marxism. You can still hear resonances of this position as if it's still suited to the world that we're in today, and so on. It didn't go anywhere. It's just been kind of displaced. And then there emerged what were called the new social movements, the NSMs, which were mostly recognition-based social movements. These are movements who are striving for recognition, identification, and so on. They want to be recognized for their identities, for their issues, for their topics, and so on. And then you had what I'm talking quite a bit here, so forgive me, but I am getting to a point. And then you get what's called the newest social movements. This was a paradigm that was described at first by Richard J.F. Day, a sociologist, an anarchist sociologist from Queen's University at the time. I don't think he's at Queen's anymore. I think he's in British Columbia or something like that. But he said the newest social movement saw the pitfalls in the OSMs and the NSMs. And those pitfalls were believing that revolution or politics was reducible to a logic of reform or revolution, both of
Mm,
which are hegemonic positions, both of which engage in a politics where you believe the world is structured by a principle of repression. There is an all against which you are showing that you are victimized or fractured as a not all, and these sorts of things.
mm,
Against that, the newest social movements emerged as a certain type of politics of retreat. And this has been my critique of the newest social movement paradigm. Basically, what you had, and you see it in Marxism, you see it in anarchist social movements, and so on, were movements suddenly refusing to engage with the world, with the dominant hegemonic structures of the world, refusing to engage in confrontations with master figures and so on, but they would build autonomous sort of spaces where they can experiment with freedom today. That's how
mm.
Hakim Bey, this post-anarchist, the first post-anarchist, perhaps put it. You know, are we destined to not taste some freedom today? Let's explore. Let's engage in some future-oriented politics. Try and build the politics that we would like to see tomorrow today, prefiguring it, and so on. And this was quite an interesting position that the newest social movements had. But I don't think we saw the way in which our revolutionary discourse contributed to our contemporary discontents. Because what you have today is precisely that. A lot of movements that are withdrawing from engagements with others, withdrawing from engagements with uh, the very figures or things or ideas that are traumatizing them. And so I think this is where we're seeing it very sharply. We're seeing it in the universities.
Okay.
Universities, I mean, I remember when I finished my second PhD, I ended up going out into the world and thinking, oh my God, the world is way different than what I thought it was when I was in the university. I never saw the way in which, in the name of liberal arts, in the name of um, um, interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, in the name of the virtues that we assign to the liberal arts, we had produced this bubble,
Mm.
this this space of retreat from the world. And so I think these are the places you really see it. You see it in today's revolutionary movements. You see it in the universities. You're seeing it kind of everywhere.
Mm. Yeah, man. You know, one of the things that's coming up for me, we don't have to spend too much time here, but you know that I kind of have a background in religion and theological studies. This, this was something that happened in certain religious communities where they would become insular and get trapped in this sort of ideological bubble, and they wouldn't literally engage the world. And I know you're not necessarily talking about that, but that's one of the analogies that's coming up in my mind is how easy it is for these communities that have like-minded beliefs to, yeah, become almost hermetic or insular and to not really engage with the world. And I think that's problematic.
It's problematic, but it's also, in a weird way, it's also truthful
Mm.
because we know that there are no relationships between these groups, you know, but now we really know that nobody is, you know, for a long time we had this idea that like we could be duped by social relationships. Like we're in a relationship, we don't see that we can never actually reach the other, that we're actually trapped in our own worlds. Today I think this secret has been revealed.
Mm.
Like we all know very well that we don't relate to anybody. I mean, look at the contemporary discussion of boundaries. I think you and I were going to talk about boundaries.
Yeah.
What is going on here on social media when we're talking about boundaries? When I read about what people are saying about boundaries, basically what I'm reading is a boundary is a way to retreat from the other. Focus on yourself, focus on what you can control only for yourself. You know, you can't control the other and this other thing. The boundary is the interface with the other.
Mm.
Boundary is a way you interface with the other. And it can go one of two ways. It can be a reason to retreat back into your own world and never enter into the tyranny of a relationship. which is, I mean, relationships are controlled forms of tyranny in a certain respect. I
That's
mean,
that's
what it
that's
is.
not going to sell very well, right? We can't put that on a t-shirt, but maybe we should.
To a greater or lesser extent, I mean, um, relationships are very difficult places. When I think about the world today, okay, our environment, whatever the environment is, whether it's capitalism, we call that, or our relationships, our environment isn't what it used to be.
Mm,
We're not in the old environment where, we had some sort of a repressive apparatus. We had a tyrannical sort of breadwinner model of the family. Some people would call that tyrannical, other people perhaps wouldn't, and this sort of stuff. Um, Today, what you have is an environment that's essentially defined by boundarylessness.
mm.
The environment, capitalism, is without boundaries. It's precisely as Todd McGowan calls it in a book that's coming out very soon. Capitalism is defined as pure excess.
Mm.
It's pure excess. It doesn't know limits. It can just keep going and going. It can destroy the environment, the third world, so-called third world.
Sure.
It can, and it's striving for limits pragmatically. It'll create commodities that will introduce limits, like cell phones that will cut out social media so that you will only make phone calls or only text certain people, or it'll give you cans of Coca-Cola. I have some in the fridge. I bought them for my son and I yesterday that are half the size,
Oh
and
yeah,
so on.
yeah. The
What
10
we're
ounce.
purchasing are what we're purchasing are limits, but the limit never holds. And so we say, okay, that limit's not good enough. We need another product. We need another commodity, and this sort of thing. So what we're dealing with in our environment today is a limitlessness that, if a boundary means anything at all, it means precisely that we put limits to our environment,
Mm.
whether that's a relationship environment or whether that's capitalism. We need some limits. Now, I'm not saying these need to be like putting people in cages and stuff like this, but
Right.
the look, when people talk about a boundary and you can only focus on your boundaries, who am I? In a sense, when you're living in an environment of limitlessness, of pure excess, there is no me yet. The boundary is precisely the breathing room where a me can exist in the context of a relationship. So if there are no boundaries placed upon the other, whether the other is capitalism, whether the other is a partner, whatever it is, if there are no boundaries there, there is no subject of love. There is
Mm.
no revolutionary subject. The boundary is precisely a limitation that can impose a place where love can emerge.
Mm.
And so I think this is the conundrum that we're in. Revolutionary politics today is operating in conjunction with the environment
Yeah.
rather than setting itself as a space against which it can offer an alternative.
Okay, good. So, Duane, I don't know if this is your language, but what's coming up for me in terms of my framework is that maybe the way you're talking about boundaries is actually a way to experience a type of freedom. Would would
Yeah,
would you would you align with that, or would you put it differently?
no, no, I like that, because who knows freedom? Who knows freedom? First off, I'll say 2 points. One is that freedom is terrifying. There's no greater suffering than to be free.
Right.
I mean, we know this everywhere from Kierkegaard to Lacan. Who knows freedom is a prisoner. The
Mm.
prisoner knows freedom very well. The prisoner experiences the desire for freedom from within the confines of his prison. And this is why, since you and my other friend Mark both like to talk and study, let's say, religious discourse or theology or religious experience. This is why I've been quite fascinated by the Islamic conception
Mm.
of caves, which is quite different from the Christian or the Platonic conception of caves. A cave is a prison, right? And in the idea of, let's say, the Christian tradition, from my reading, and perhaps it's a poor reading, but it serves me, the idea is you need to get out of the cave. This is resurrection and
Right.
this the enlightenment, get out of the cave, stop being a prisoner, experience freedom, and this sort of stuff. Not at all. What happens in Islam, in the story of the seven sleepers of the cave, you have people who are living in a pagan world of excess. It's a world where you are free. radically free. It's by interpretation, radically free to worship any god, to be an atheist, whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. It's pure masturbatory enjoyment, is
Sure.
precisely what it is. And they realize that this enjoyment is a horrible way to suffer.
Mm.
So they go in search of a cave that they can tolerate. And what I find fascinating is, against the nightmare of pure excess, the nightmare of the environment, they find a cave and a belief that they can tolerate. And they go to sleep, they dream, and the dreams push the nightmare into the background. And I think that's a revolutionary act,
Mm.
to find your prison. I'm not saying we should all go to prison. I'm saying find a prison. Find a prison that suits you. Find a prison that you're comfortable with. A prison that will give you the space from which to dream of a freedom.
Mm.
I'm not saying we should subjugate ourselves to tyranny and all this other stuff, but a relationship is a prison
Yeah.
in
So
some sense.
so so
It's
so
a prison
Duane,
of one.
yeah, absolutely. And I think me, I'm not interested in like formulas or easy steps, but I'm curious kind of what's coming up, even as my role as a therapist, because I love this idea of finding your prison. How would you then encourage someone who has found a prison to stay connected or to communicate with others in their prison? I'll throw out that kind of image and see where you go with that.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of practices. Some prisoners write on the walls. Some prisoners, I don't know if you saw V for Vendetta,
No, I
um,
haven't.
putting letters underneath, or writing letters.
Mm,
You know, um, Writing a letter can be a wonderful way to communicate in a relationship. The love letter, the love letter is a wonderful tool. I mean, you're really writing to yourself, but in writing to yourself, you're making the other present. um, but prisoners, there's a long history of prisoners communicating with the outside world through their prison window, through a screen, you know, and that screen is what Lacanians call fantasy.
mm,
Um, so, I mean, I don't know. I've had patients who describe things like this, being out in a crowd and there's activists everywhere and so on, and they're communicating with prisoners who are hanging out of the windows. So I think this is the condition for communication, not a way to preclude communication. What
mm.
we're doing out here in the world of freedom, we might think it's communicating, but it's not. We're communicating with our enjoyment, which is quite different. To communicate with your enjoyment um, is not to communicate in a way where you can ever experience um, the the loss of enjoyment that would give rise to an interest in others.
Mm,
So, I mean, Marshall McLuhan, a very long time ago, way before the internet, described this phenomena as an echo chamber.
mm.
We hear only what we want to hear.
Absolutely. Man, that's so resonant with me kind of nowadays. You know, one of the things that's coming up for me too is just thinking about some of our previous discussions. I know we both kind of have an interest at some level around like autism. Do you see the autistic experience as a type of cave experience, as a type of being in one's own world and then trying to figure out how to communicate with others?
Absolutely, I think it is. I think in
I do
some, like,
too.
just in a theoretical way,
Sure.
I think we might want to risk generalizing the experience of autism, just in a thought experiment way, because what we discover in autistic experience is um, the loss of the other, but the subsequent attempt to invent an other.
Mm,
And the way that autistic people tend to invent others is not unlike the way that many of us tend to invent a space for the other. I'm not saying it actually brings the other into existence, but it's close. We do it with our products, with the clothes that we make when we put it on Etsy, with our philosophizing. We philosophize today from the bedroom. It's tethered to our sense of ourselves. It's not separate from us. We don't feel exploited or alienated from what we're producing, like we did in the good old days of industrial capitalism, according to Marx. You know, when we build
Right.
products today, we're doing it literally from our bedrooms. You know, we're not leaving the bedroom feeling disconnected or alienated from our products, which would be a neurotic experience. The autistic experience is, this is something I've fashioned. It's my choice. I'm not alienated in the four ways that Marx claimed that I'm alienated from the product.
Mm,
The object hasn't fallen off. Objet petit a hasn't fallen off. I'm tethered to it. So, you know, I make costumes, I put it on Etsy, but I choose what these costumes are. I choose the product. I choose how it's made. I choose if and when I want to sell it. I choose who I'm going to work with. And this is a very fraternal approach in a sense, you know? So we end up in relationships with people who, in some sense, are um, part of that practice.
sure.
And we can
Oh,
only
that's
relate
so,
to them through our costumes, through our inventions, I think.
yeah. Oh, that's so good, Duane. Yeah, no, I really, really resonate with that. Man, thank you. I guess another thing that's maybe coming up for me is thinking about, and yes, this is kind of connected to the recent book, or the book that's coming out that you worked on with Mark Murphy, kind of negativity and psychoanalysis. Is there anything you can say about that, and how maybe that might connect to some of the things we've been talking about?
Yeah, I can try. I'm not sure what I can say, but I mean, the book came out of a feeling, a confusion on my part. I don't want to speak for Mark. I presume it might be similar to the answer I'm giving, but maybe
Sure,
not. I mean, Mark has his own trajectory, his own
sure,
ideas, his own way of relating to this stuff. But it's clear that Mark and I have a similar sort of program. Um, but I think we noticed that the concept of negativity and the theory of death drive was being used in a particular way that didn't resonate for us in our readings. And so we were confused. It wasn't that we thought we knew the correct way to interpret death drive and how death drive is manifested in contemporary culture today, or what toxic positivity is, but we were just really confused and we were doubting our knowledge about what that meant. And so we wanted to gather together people from disparate traditions, clinic, philosophy, theology, sociology, and so on, to see how they kind of were dealing with this. And we were led to the conclusion that a lot of times when people are using these words, negativity, death drive, and so on, they're using them as if they're still situated within a bygone era.
mm,
There's something tremendously positive about death drive. There's something tremendously positive about war. There's something tremendously positive about culture today. So when we talk about negativity and how we are so negative and critical and all this stuff in our philosophy, critical theory, there's nothing less critical than critical theory today,
mm,
in my estimation. It's resolutely positive. In what sense? What Lacan discovered from Death Drive wasn't negativity. It was the positivity of what Lacan called jouissance. There is an aspect of jouissance that, I mean, when you're reading Freud's work on the death drive, he describes a membrane. There's this protective barrier, you know, where you're constantly, the positivity of your enjoyment is constantly encountering a traumatic negative force that exists in the world.
mm.
So we thought it's really weird that things have gotten twisted, because when people are describing negativity, what they're actually doing is testifying to their own jouissance. There's no negativity here. Um, so this is what we were trying to do. There is a non-negativized. That's how I know in the book describes it, but it's also, I think, how Jacques Lemaitre and others describe it. There is something of enjoyment that refuses to be relinquished.
Mm.
It's really difficult to let go of this positive substance that we call jouissance and that is tethered to the body. We won't let go of our philosophical presuppositions. We won't let go of our educational indoctrination. You know, I was in university for like 18 years or something. You know, it's really hard after you've studied, let's say, Marxism for a really, really long time. You've read David Harvey, you've read Frederick Jameson, you've read Zizek and all this stuff, to suddenly say, wait a minute, maybe this isn't necessarily describing the world we're in anymore. There's a
Mm,
certainty and a conviction in these positions, and it's absolutely implicated in our jouissance.
mm. Yeah, man, that's so good. No, and I hear you coming back to some of these themes throughout your different writing and podcasts, and it's kind of exciting to think about where it's going to head, where it's going to go. I know you've been reflecting on artificial intelligence. I mean, there's some things we've been talking about offline that are really interesting. I wonder how you find yourself maybe utilizing some of these ideas in terms of actual practices or other things that are going on in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I try and pay attention to what's happening in the world, but I never get too smart about it. You know, um, uh, AI, I think is really interesting to me,
Mm,
and what I tried to do is sort of situate three modalities of the scientific death drive. Lacan said it clearly: science is death drive. Science is death drive. And I think we're really on the cusp of something today, because what we realized from the plague was that science um, moves in such a way that it always encounters its limits too late. And when it does, it's traumatizing. And
mm,
the plague, COVID, was an example. Um, suddenly, perhaps something slipped from under a lab door. Those are Lacan's words from La Troisième, way before the plague. Perhaps something slips under the laboratory door, and now we have to face the consequences. And then we scramble to try and come up with ethics, pragmatic measures, drugs, more scientific solutions to fix what we've caused. So from the plague, we realized that science has an impact upon the body. We feel it. It's a feverish impact. We're very sick from science in our bodies. And as you move from plague to new technologies, new media, finally to artificial intelligence, and the way in which AI is now, in this very moment, being connected to various forms of gadgets,
mm.
therapy culture, to the one that I find most fascinating are sex gadgets, sex dolls that are increasingly being incorporated with AI, is that we can see the way in which artificial intelligence um, uh, demonstrates that science can approach something of science fiction. And when it approaches a fiction, we can see that it's capable of confronting a lie.
Mm,
And it's only when you can confront the lie that you can enter into the field of the other. The field of the other for Lacan's the field of lies. Science is all about truth. There's no lies. It's certainty. It's formulaic, so on. There's no
yeah.
lies when it comes to science in some really naive sense. But as you approach science fiction, you can see the lie. And it's only by passing through the lie that you can encounter the other. You can
Mm.
encounter otherness. And I think that this is what artificial intelligence can bring us to finally confront. Lacan liked science fiction. He didn't like science so much.
Okay. Yeah, I'm kind of the same way. So would the lie be a type of boundary?
I think the lie is a boundary. I think ultimately the boundary is a lie that you're willing to accept. It's a rule.
Go
You're
with
willing
that.
to.
That's an interesting way to think about boundaries and relationships. I mean, they're a type of fiction.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Um, it's a type of fiction and friction, and
Mm,
I think that the boundary is, we know it's bullshit. When people on Twitter are talking about boundaries in the last week or two,
yes.
they're talking like, I'm not going to be duped by this manipulative bullshit. And they're right. They shouldn't be duped by it in a sense. They want to be on the side of truth.
Right.
They're not duped by the bullshit. But a boundary is a bound error. It's a
Mm,
bound error. It's a way to bind yourself to an other through an error, through a lie, through a lot of error. it's a space of fiction, and you say, okay, I know it's bullshit, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Mm.
And that's why I always say, to fall in love, you really have to allow yourself to be stupid. These non-dupes that now populate our universe, I wouldn't say world, but our universe, these non-dupes, what they're ultimately incapable of doing is loving, because for
Oh,
them, love is tyranny. Love is tyranny. And what it produces is, I've been experimenting with this idea. I see it also in the Antigone uh, story or narrative, is that it produces a situation where when you fall in love, um, as a, let's say, as a man, you either have to be a simp, and the simp is simply a prop, a costume for the other who doesn't want to relate to you, friend zoned, whatever else,
sure.
or you're a tyrant in the worst sense of the term. You're the
Mm.
person who's going to traumatize them. So my idea, and I'm taking it in some sense from anarchism, where anarchism says neither slaves nor masters. We
Okay.
say neither simps nor tyrants, in
Okay.
this sort of sense. And what an acceptance of a boundary does, certain limits to your enjoyment, it allows your partner to neither be a simp nor a tyrant.
Mm.
And I mean, that takes courage, because it really is a risk. Your partner could be a tyrant. They could oppress you. They could be manipulative. They could be controlling. To what extent do you accept a little bit of tyranny in your life? Um, Perhaps it'll come with some simp behavior as well.
Sure.
The price you pay, um, you may get love,
Mm.
but the non-dupes won't love. They'll
Man,
be
that's so,
single.
yeah. Now, okay, so Duane, and we can kind of edit this out if we don't want to include it, but can you take everything you've talked about and explore the semi recent thing that came out with Jonah Hill? Are you able to go there at some level?
I can try. It takes
Okay.
it takes a little bit of courage to do that. Yeah. But
Hey, I got you.
well, it seems to me that this neoliberal idea that the boundary is only for Jonah Hill,
Mm.
I see that as a neoliberal idea. Look, if you're living in a limitless environment and you're only focusing on yourself, you're going to allow capitalism to continue to fuck with the rest of, to fuck with the rest of the world, to affect the environment in the way it has, to produce the worst type of destruction on the planet. uh, you're not going to limit that. I mean, to
Mm.
take a really extreme example, and I'm not suggesting that they are the same. If you're living in a society that seems to be about limitless tyranny, it's your ethical responsibility, if you care about that society, to say, hold on now, let's set some limits that we can both live with.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important, because we've lost sight of the fact that our society isn't what it used to be when Marx was describing it. Before 1844, I should say. Marx before 1844, when he was talking about commodity fetishism, when he was talking about, even when he's talking about surplus value, when he's talking about the four types of alienation and these sorts of things. I'm sorry, that's not the world we're living in anymore. That's a part of the world, but that doesn't characterize the world as such, the universe of capitalism today.
Mm.
Um, in the old days, how was tyranny function? Tyranny was at the level of the all. It anchored the social order together. It would exploit you. It would extract something from you, and so on. And relationships were, in some sense, tyrannical. And it took us a while to realize that the idea of the nuclear family, as stabilizing as it was for society, there was one half of society, women, who were disproportionately affected by that in ways that were quite horrible. This separates my discourse from somebody like Jordan Peterson, for example, because I do believe that patriarchy was a horrible thing, and I don't want to go back to it.
Right.
Yet, on the other hand, this isn't the world that we're living in anymore. If you look at um, how Nazism used to function, it used to explicitly exclude Jews, Freemasons, homosexuals, and so on, and try and kick them out of the society.
Right.
Yeah, it was an explicit prohibition, but in a society of enjoyment, of pure excess, and these sorts of things, you don't have explicit prohibitions anymore. You have affirmations, and we're seeing it more and more at the level of policy. Um, it's not what you can't do, it's what not only you can do, but in some sense you have to do. You must enjoy yourself.
Yeah.
And if you don't enjoy yourself in this particular way, then you are not explicitly excluded, you are implicitly excluded, but in a much more terrible way. It's a much more tyrannical form of exclusion, because you can't point at the problem and say, look, this, you have anti-Semitic legislation or whatever else. You have implicit exclusions, which shifts the tyranny from the symbolic into the real.
Mm.
And I think that makes our situation not better today. We can talk about the progress that we've gone through in civilization. Hard, I mean, blood, sweat, and tears went into the progress that we have achieved, but I think we're in a worse situation today.
Mm.
Today, more than ever, we know that patriarchy is tyrannical, and we're really feeling the effects. That we've never heard a more popular attack upon patriarchy than we do today. In the
Mm.
time of patriarchy, when it was really severe, we didn't hear as many people complaining about it, but now we do. At a time when it's not as supposedly as severe, at least not in the symbolic. It's not, we don't have the prohibitions that we used to have. These prohibitions still exist. I'm not denying that, but it's
Sure.
not the dominant order.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that's coming up for me is I know I've mentioned this guy on the podcast. I feel like some people love him, some people hate him. I probably both love and hate him, like I do almost everybody, including myself. Byung-Chul Han, he's the South Korean philosopher, and he has one book, The Burnout Society, where he says, and I guess he's drawing on Foucault, but in the kind of disciplinary kind of society context, the modal verb was, and he kind of connects it to the superego, was you should or you must. But now in what he calls the achievement society, the modal verb is you can. And I know that's kind of similar to what Zizek does with like the superego, but I found that just fascinating because he
Yeah.
ultimately argues that's more oppressive because we end up just kind of oppressing ourselves than it was in the past.
We have to take more responsibility for our own behaviors.
Yeah.
That's what today's boundary discourse is saying. You are
Yeah.
responsible for your own behaviors. That's much worse than being able to blame another person for your
Yeah.
behaviors. But I would go a little bit further
Please.
than you can, and I think this is something that Zizek also misses. It's not simply you can. It's sometimes it's okay.
Mm.
Sometimes. And
Okay.
the
So yeah,
sometimes is
help me
important.
understand that.
Yeah, the sometimes is important because it introduces a pragmatic version of the limit, or a pragmatic version of the affirmation of what you can do. And I think that's really difficult because before we would have a rule, some sort of a law, you can't, whatever. And that law would endure in time. So it would be the same at time A as it would be at time B, as C, and so on.
Sure.
Today we have sometimes it's okay. So you can implement a particular rule at time A, and it can be mutually exclusive to the same rule that you would a different rule that you would implement at time B. So perhaps you can say it's okay to be in a relationship where your partner engages in promiscuous sexuality. At time B, you can say if your partner engages in promiscuous sexuality, you don't respect yourself so much, and it's okay to walk away. Time C, you can say something different. And this is precisely what we see on Twitter, social media today. We see these little aphoristic statements, words of wisdom, and so on, where you basically can affirm any behavior at any time. And these words of wisdom, I think, are tyrannical because they don't endure in time. And what they do is they produce in the moment a sense of a certain type of rule, but it's actually a rule that's saturated in jouissance. There's no prohibition there. And it allows you just to get to the next rule, to get to the next one, to get to the next one. And I think it's a really limitless form of legislation.
Yeah. Oh man, that's so good. So okay, Duane, I know we have maybe 10 minutes or so. Um, is there anything else that you've kind of been thinking about or writing about or just wrestling with theoretically, existentially, that you kind of just want to throw out there that might be interesting to explore? I'm loving where this conversation has gone. I'm just curious if there's something I've missed asking you, or just something that's energizing you that we could explore together.
Yeah, it's tough for me because, things have changed. I used to have research questions and I used to have research projects, and now what really excites me is I hear what people are saying,
Mm,
and what people are saying or what they're doing in society or in the clinic. I take that as my fuel to theorize. And in this way, I wouldn't say that I necessarily have a particular project, except for the fact that I'm interested in whatever is happening today, the contemporary discontents of culture. I'm most fascinated by the fact that we are experiencing significant uh, feelings among people of social, what would you call it, dislocation. People don't feel included. People can't seem to get out of their bedrooms today. We're engaging with the world through the fuzzy boundaries or the fuzzy mediations of contemporary social media. Media used to be a boundary, used to
mm,
introduce boundaries. You can either go from one news channel to another, and there'd be a
right.
boundary. Or social media, it's like it's not mediating anymore. All it's doing is it's allowing us to stay in our rooms. It's allowing us to reach out to the world without actually going out into the world.
Mm,
And so I've been thinking about how this idea of philosophy in the bedroom could be taken quite literally today. Philosophy today, I think, is entirely reducible to the bedroom.
mm.
It's it's you know
This sounds
you
sexy. I like it.
I mean, it is sexy in a way. It's quite sexy, and that's the problem. Philosophy is very sexy. It's a problem for psychoanalysis. Freud once said that philosophers are trying to patch up holes in the world.
Yeah.
In some sense, we could read that as an attempt to not encounter the limits to the bedroom, so that you can
Mm,
actually step outside again and feel that anxiety of having to cross a threshold, cross out into the world beyond the insularity of your own enjoyment, to
mm.
see that other people have their own forms of enjoyment too. And perhaps some of those forms of enjoyment seem to you to be passe. Maybe heterosexuality is passe for some people, but it's nonetheless a form of enjoyment like any other.
Yeah.
And to kind of see that other people can experience the world differently than the way we do, and engage in different discursive practices and different forms of philosophy and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a bit of a tricky one for me because I'm not even sure I know how to define something like masculinity, but I know in certain ways that's become a bit passe to kind of identify as a man or to find some kind of jouissance in being a man. What are your thoughts on that? I know that's a tricky one. I
It's
know.
really tricky because traditionally in the clinic, the masculine question, let's call it, it's a
Yeah.
discursive question in the for Lacan. Mostly, it's a discursive question. It's not without biology, but it's certainly not reducible to biology.
No.
So the question of masculinity versus the question of femininity, it's really paradoxical, because we could say if there were two major questions in the clinic traditionally, it was, am I a man or am I a woman? What is my gender? It's a gender question, gender
Yeah.
trouble. That's one question. The other is a question confronting death. Am I alive or am I dead? One was a hysterical question, was an obsessional question. Today, men are asking questions about what it means to be a man.
Mm.
That's a feminine position from which to ask a question. You're asking a question about what am I to the other? What
Yeah.
is my, am I really this man I claim myself to be, and so on. And so increasingly we hear people who we would traditionally consider to be men, perhaps some would call them cis men or whatever else,
Sure.
asking the question of their gender. But to ask that question is to presuppose already that masculinity is not what it used to be.
Mm.
It's not what it used to be. The simp or the tyrant, for example, to be a simp or a tyrant is no longer to be a man.
Yeah.
And so I think that this is a problem. On the other hand, we can ask, what is a woman? Which is a question that has been asked by a lot of people. And I've been totally dissatisfied about the answers that I've heard because
Mm.
we don't have an answer for the left anymore, if the word left means anything anymore, and I'm not sure
Sure.
it does. But I mean, if I were to situate myself on a political spectrum, traditionally it would be on the far left. I'm not saying I'm there anymore. I'm not sure quite what it means, but the question on the left, um, um, it's um, it's typically a woman is a woman. A woman is a person who identifies as a woman.
The
And that
tautology.
it is a tautology in a certain circular way. I'm not saying all the left says this.
Sure.
The left isn't without uh, a biological answer as well, and so on. On the right, we hear a woman is biology. A woman
Hmm.
is equal to biology. And I don't think either of these positions are satisfying to me. You know,
They're not to me
uh,
either.
I think both of those positions come with problems. Um, it's to be discovered what a woman is. On the one hand,
Mm.
um, both of those positions conceal what is most at stake in the enigma of femininity. When we answer the question, what is a woman, we've already lost the point because it's the question that defines
Mm.
the feminine position in a certain respect. It's the question without an answer.
Yeah.
And to live with that is really difficult, I think.
Dude, I love that. And that's one of the reasons I love psychoanalysis. Yeah,
It was
that's really,
it was Freud's position. I posted this on Twitter a few days ago or
yeah.
yesterday, a few days ago. Freud said it's not our position to answer what is a woman. You know, in contemporary culture, look, you see only two positions. It's about time we offer a third. You
Mm.
know, the position is a woman is a woman. Okay, that's one valid position. Absolutely. A woman is tied to biology. That's also a valid position. You know, there are different paradigms of jouissance. But the psychoanalytic position is to say, well, I don't know. Let's begin there.
Yeah. Oh man. Man, you're speaking to my heart. This is great. Now, I know you've mentioned several times in this episode, like this conversation, the simp. And man, I'll just be honest and say all, you know that I work with a lot of men in I do psychotherapy, not psychoanalysis, but I would say ideas from psychoanalysis really inform just who I am as a person in my work as a therapist. I'll have guys that come in and part of what they're wanting to work on is not being a simp. They use that language. And
Yeah.
so I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on why so many men feel like they are simps or what's led them to that point. I know there's no easy answer here, but I'm just curious if you could riff on that because it's just something I often think about and work with.
It's a difficult thing. I think first off, we would be wise to relinquish our fear of being a simp.
Mm.
There's nothing wrong with being kind, uh, cordial, caring, and so on. I think what people are afraid of is the limitlessness of a relationship where one is giving everything they have
Mm.
and feeling like there's no breathing room for themselves or their own desires, and so they get kind of devoured um,
Mm.
by the other. And I think this is the fear, and that fear can give rise to an overexertion or toward masculinity, a move to the tyrannical position as a counterpoint. Very dangerous. You don't want to move to the tyrannical position. Um, and it could also give rise to a nostalgia for what you believe has been lost, which is
Mm.
what? Patriarchy? You really want to go back there? You want to go back to a world structured by fathers? No, that world's gone. And so I think I'm mostly interested in the fear of being a simp.
Okay.
Uh, because from men, what you hear is the fear of being a simp. You don't hear, I want to be a simp. I love being a simp.
Right.
It's a fear of accepting your own boundaries and and living with them. If it means that you have to walk away from a position that's traumatizing to you, then walk
Mm,
away.
mm,
You just walk away from it. You're not obligated to remain in an environment that's asphyxiating. You
mm.
can walk away. There's nothing tyrannical about walking away. It also means you don't have to respond to it with virility and anger and ruthless control mechanisms, which is the counterpoint to the simp position. As I say, neither simp nor tyrant.
Yeah. No, and to have the boundary to walk away, I'm gonna use the language because I don't care if I get canceled, that you're not being a pussy or weak or anything like that. You're not being a bitch, as some of my clients put it, if you engage in that type of distancing.
Well, the best way uh, to avoid the simp position is to be calm and caring, and to accept that you you can have a life for yourself that's not reducible to your relationship.
You can have a life that's not reducible to your relationship. Okay, say some more about that. I love that, Duane.
Well, I think that there are many people today who are finding that the best way to implement lack in their personal private relationships is to not always be available for them. It doesn't
Mm,
mean that you disappear from the relationship, but it
sure.
means that in having a passion, philosophy, a career, whatever else, you're also introducing a space um, that can mediate the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really well said. Yeah. Okay, Duane, I know in a second I need to jump off, but maybe before we end, is there anything that you want to either promote or just throw out there in terms of where people can find you if they're interested in your work? I'd love to just continue to connect some of my audience to you and to what you're up to.
Um, I think people can find me if they're looking. It's okay. There's nothing really that I want. There's nothing really that I want to promote. There's, like, I suppose there's a few books coming out this year. Um, I have a new book called titled Psychoanalytic Sociology that's
Mm,
coming out where I'm. It's with Bloomsbury,
okay.
and it's a book that Slavoj Žižek encouraged me to write,
Mm,
which is an attempt to offer another approach, not just to um, Zizek's work,
yeah.
but also to sociology as it's being taught in the university today. So I go right back to the beginning, to the foundations of sociology, some of the so-called forefathers of sociology, and I reread them.
Mm,
And I try and offer another point of departure for thinking about sociology that's not trapped in the paradigm that it's a bygone paradigm, the sociological imagination and this sort of stuff.
okay.
Um, and
Damn,
what
that
I
sounds
do,
fascinating.
I focus on the concept of strangeness and the stranger. And I say
Okay.
this, whereas we used to talk about strangers in sociology, now we can
Yeah.
talk about sociology itself as a strange discipline. And it
Mm,
makes it quite different. And the way in which, I know we only have a minute or two, the way in which
yeah.
social bonds themselves used to have strangers within them, people on the periphery who were trying to move to the center, people that were kind of in the group but not of the group, and this sort
Sure.
of stuff. But now I think this isn't the dominant paradigm. I think now what we have is strangeness elevated to a very principle of the social bond. And what that produces is what we've been talking about: fraternities, segregation from the world, insular modes of enjoyment, and this sort of stuff. And I'm trying to make that the subject matter of sociology, maybe as a way to rescue sociology, because I really think it's in a major crisis today. It can't speak to the world that we're
Mm,
in precisely because it's contributing to the very problem it has charged itself with analyzing.
wow. That's great, man. Okay, I
It's gone
can't
meta.
wait to
It's
read
gone meta.
that. Well, do you know when it comes out?
I think at the end of the year, it's in print right now. Maybe a few months. I don't know. It's not on the Bloomsbury page yet.
Okay.
Um, so we'll see. It's a thick book, and it's playful, but it's more rigorous than some of the other books I've put out recently that are just me speaking and transcriptions.
Okay. Man, well, I'm gonna have to buy that and hopefully I can have you on and we can do a bit of a series on it or something. That'd be fun.
I would love that. I would love that. I love the really rigorous theoretical stuff.
Okay. Yeah. I do too. I don't always understand it, but maybe I like to pretend.
Awesome. Let's
Oh,
pretend that's a fiction worth pursuing.
okay. All right, man. Well, hey, thanks again, and I'm sure we'll be in touch.